High in the Appalachian Mountains, where fog coils through endless pine ridges and silence cuts deeper than steel, a nightmare lived in plain sight. Behind the rotting timbers of an isolated wooden house, a man named Ezekiel Blackwood built a kingdom of darkness that lasted nearly 2 decades. But this was no myth, no fireside legend. It was real. From 1938 to 1958, Ezekiel imprisoned his younger brothers, forcing them into a cycle of twisted bloodlines. What he called lineage preservation was in truth a grotesque experiment, a nightmare that scarred generations and turned one family into a living horror story. If dark history, hidden scandals, and forgotten horrors fascinate you, stick around. Hit like, tap subscribe, and share this story with someone who thinks they've heard it all, because this one will leave them speechless. The Appalachian Mountains have always carried an air of secrecy. Men who lived there often vanished into solitude, building small cabins away from roads. In that vast wilderness, Ezekiel Blackwood was already shaping his own destiny. Born in 1905, Ezekiel entered a world defined by coal mines and silence. His father was crushed in a mining collapse. His uncle, a stern and bitter man, became his sole male guardian, shaping him with cruelty. The uncle who raised him believed discipline was survival. He used his fists more than his words, treating Ezekiel less like kin and more like a burden. Those early scars hardened Ezekiel's resolve into something darker. By 12, Ezekiel was a boy without mercy, learning quickly that kindness only brought weakness. His uncle's farm was isolated, forcing Ezekiel to labor endlessly. The mountains whispered lessons of endurance, silence, and suspicion of outsiders. Neighbors rarely saw him, but when they did, they noticed his distant gaze. He spoke little, listened less, and carried himself like a man twice his age. Hardship carved his face into something prematurely severe. In 1930, his uncle's sudden death left Ezekiel alone. Inheriting the mountain property, he stood at a crossroads: abandon the cursed land or claim it as his kingdom. He chose the latter, vowing independence forever. That vow twisted over time. Independence became obsession. Freedom became domination. Ezekiel began constructing not only cabins and fences, but ideas of control, strength, and a bloodline unsullied by outsiders. A storm was gathering. He invited his younger brothers, still teenagers, to join him on the mountain land. He promised them food, protection, and belonging. They accepted, unaware of the nightmare awaiting them behind those trees. The road to the Blackwood homestead was barely passable. Mud swallowed wagon wheels, roots tore at boots, and pine shadows loomed. Once his brothers crossed that path, there was no easy return to civilization. The house itself was imposing, though crumbling. A 2-story frame of weathered wood surrounded by makeshift cabins. It was less a home, more a fortress. Ezekiel kept it shrouded under towering oaks, hidden from watchful eyes. Men in nearby towns spoke of the Blackwood place in hushed tones. They rarely saw the brothers except when Ezekiel strode into town for supplies. Even then, his presence radiated authority and something unsettling. Ezekiel preached strange ideas, rooted in warped readings of science. He spoke of strength and purity, of keeping the Blackwood name untarnished. To those few who listened, his words sounded eccentric but harmless. Behind closed doors, those words grew into laws. Ezekiel commanded his brothers as if they were soldiers under his rule. Every task, every meal, every movement was dictated by his iron hand. He saw his younger brothers not as equals, but as tools for his vision. Ezekiel believed blood could be refined like steel, forged into something stronger through repetition. His doctrine was twisted, but unwavering. The first signs of his plan appeared in his meticulous journals. He recorded traits of his brothers: their hair, their eyes, their strength. To him, these details were not memories but genetic material to manipulate. Isolation aided him. The mountains silenced questions. Neighbors adhered to an unspoken code. Men minded their own affairs. In such places, privacy was sacred, and interference was a sin. Ezekiel thrived under that secrecy. By 1938, his obsession had crystallized. He told his brothers they would preserve the Blackwood name forever. The line would remain theirs alone, unbroken by strangers. To them, it was a command, not a choice. Thus began Ezekiel Blackwood's descent, a descent not into madness alone, but into domination. What outsiders would call horror, he called duty. And in those mountains, his reign of twisted blood had only just begun. Ezekiel's homestead became a prison disguised as a refuge. His younger brothers, initially grateful for shelter, soon realized the mountain property was not freedom. It was a cage, and Ezekiel was its warden. The brothers were forbidden from leaving. Ezekiel rationed supplies, assigning every task with military precision. Hunting, chopping wood, planting corn, each duty carried punishment if failed. The land itself became their chain. Visitors rarely came. When they did, Ezekiel controlled the interaction. He alone spoke to outsiders, presenting himself as a stoic mountain man. His brothers remained shadows, silent figures glimpsed behind shuttered windows. Suspicion grew among the locals, but mountain men valued silence over confrontation. A saying echoed through taverns: "You tend your land, he tends his." That code allowed Ezekiel's darkness to thrive. Inside, the air grew heavier with each passing year. Ezekiel's journals described his younger brothers not as companions, but as subjects. He measured their traits as if cataloging livestock, reducing men into specimens. He ruled with manipulation as much as violence. He told his brothers the outside world would enslave them, that strangers hunted their kind. Fear became the invisible fence, stronger than any locked door. When one brother questioned the restrictions, Ezekiel's response was brutal. He beat him until silence replaced defiance. The message was clear. Disobedience meant pain, and no brother dared test him again. Ezekiel expanded the homestead to reinforce control. He built additional cabins, not for comfort, but for separation. Each brother was given a space, but Ezekiel controlled when doors opened or closed. The isolation grew deeper. Days blurred into seasons. None of the brothers saw towns again. They chopped, planted, and labored under Ezekiel's watch, convinced no life existed beyond those ridges. One brother, the eldest after Ezekiel, tried to escape. He vanished into the forest one night, carrying nothing but determination. 3 days later, Ezekiel returned with him bloodied, broken, and silent. That escape attempt became legend within the house. Ezekiel paraded the captured brother before the others, proof of futility. "The mountains belong to me," he declared. "There is no freedom here." From that day forward, obedience was absolute. Brothers no longer spoke of leaving. They followed orders mechanically. Their identities eroded until they existed only as extensions of Ezekiel's will. Ezekiel deepened his obsession with bloodlines. He told his brothers their purpose was greater than survival. They would extend the Blackwood name, untainted by outsiders. It was no suggestion. It was law. He began orchestrating pairings among his own brothers. The household shifted from captivity into something darker, an experiment. Ezekiel dictated who lay with whom, recording outcomes like a scientist, though his science was monstrous. The first offspring born of this twisted order was seen by neighbors only once. Ezekiel carried the boy to town, claiming he belonged to a distant cousin. None questioned him, respecting the mountain code. More offspring followed, each raised within the compound's walls. Some appeared strong, others bore visible afflictions. Ezekiel documented everything, convinced he was creating a perfected line of Blackwood sons destined to outlast civilization itself. The brothers had become not only captives, but vessels for Ezekiel's vision. Their bodies were no longer their own. Their children, too, were trapped in a cycle none dared break. By the late 1940s, Ezekiel's household was no longer simply a cabin in the woods. It was a fortress of fear, a factory of blood, and a secret too terrible to imagine. Ezekiel's journals reveal the depth of his obsession. Each entry was a ledger of blood, measurements of strength, eye color, illnesses. He wrote not like a brother, but like a scientist dissecting specimens. To outsiders, Ezekiel appeared eccentric yet ordinary. In town, he spoke little, purchased tools, salt, and grain, then vanished back into the mountains. No one imagined his true project, forging blood into legacy. Inside the compound, his doctrine hardened. He preached that outsiders carried weakness, corruption, and sickness. Only Blackwood blood was pure. His brothers, indoctrinated by years of fear, rarely questioned his proclamations. The children born of his orders bore the weight of Ezekiel's obsession. Some were strong, others suffered deformities. Yet Ezekiel viewed every birth as validation, each son a stepping stone toward his vision. When one child died from congenital illness, Ezekiel did not grieve. He recorded it clinically. Failure of form. His detachment terrified his brothers, but his authority remained unshaken. No voice dared oppose him. As years passed, the compound swelled. Small cabins filled with sons. Older boys were forced to labor while younger ones grew up beneath Ezekiel's shadow, learning only his twisted laws of purity. Formal education was forbidden. Ezekiel declared that books carried corruption. Instead, he taught his own scripture. Bloodlines, strength, obedience. To the younger generation, he was not just a father figure, but a prophet. Isolation compounded their ignorance. Sons raised without contact beyond the compound believed Ezekiel's words were truth. Mountains were walls, towns were dangers, and only Blackwood blood ensured survival. It was indoctrination perfected. The deformities increased with time. Some boys were born with extra digits. Others carried twisted spines. A few had fragile hearts that failed before adolescence. Ezekiel dismissed these tragedies as sacrifices for perfection. Medical help was never sought. Ill sons suffered in silence, their conditions untreated. When neighbors questioned rare appearances of weak boys, Ezekiel claimed they suffered from hereditary ailments common in mountain blood. None argued. Each season, Ezekiel's control deepened. He dictated pairings among brothers and their offspring, extending his experiment across generations. Resistance was crushed before it began, beaten out by fists or silenced through fear. The eldest son, Joseph, showed signs of rebellion. Strong in body but unstable in mind, he raged against his father's domination. Ezekiel saw him not as threat, but as successor to continue the bloodline. Joseph's anger alternated with submission, a cycle Ezekiel interpreted as strength tempered by fire. He began grooming Joseph to enforce his decrees, teaching him the journals, the rituals, and the so-called science of purity. Other sons bore marks of despair. One boy, born deaf, communicated through gestures with remarkable intelligence. Yet Ezekiel dismissed him as flawed, refusing him any authority. His potential went unnoticed. His voice ignored. Life within the compound became a grim cycle. Rise before dawn, labor until dusk, obey Ezekiel, and repeat. For the brothers and sons alike, hope of change dwindled with every passing year. By the mid-1940s, whispers of doubt flickered among younger sons. They saw sickness, deformity, and death mounting. Yet Ezekiel's grip was unbreakable. His fists, his words, and his myths kept them shackled. The compound was no longer merely a home. It had become a laboratory of blood, where every man was both prisoner and subject. Ezekiel's twisted experiment had reshaped their lives into a nightmare. And yet, despite disease, death, and despair, Ezekiel stood unwavering. To him, failure meant nothing. Only purity mattered. The Blackwood line would continue, no matter the cost, no matter the ruin it carried. The compound filled with boys who knew no world beyond the ridges. Each was bound by Ezekiel's rules, growing under his hand like saplings twisted to fit a crooked mold. Older sons were ordered to command younger ones. Authority was layered beneath Ezekiel, creating a hierarchy where obedience flowed downward like water. Brothers disciplined brothers, ensuring loyalty to the system above all. Work defined their days. At dawn, boys chopped wood, tilled soil, hunted game. Every task reinforced dependence on the compound. Strangers might question absence from school, but Ezekiel insisted labor was education. Some sons appeared healthy, strong-bodied, sharp-eyed. Others bore unmistakable marks of the experiment. Curved spines, cleft palates, missing teeth, and trembling hands became common sights. Their existence was reduced to survival and silence. Those who faltered in labor were punished. Ezekiel declared weakness shameful. A sickly boy might be forced to haul stones until collapse, his suffering catalogued in journals as a lesson rather than tragedy. Joseph, the eldest, gained authority second only to Ezekiel. Though erratic, his strength impressed his father. He barked orders at younger brothers, punishing them swiftly, modeling his rule after Ezekiel's iron hand. Other sons developed quieter roles. One boy with mismatched eyes devised hand signals to communicate with deaf brothers. Despite brilliance, Ezekiel dismissed him as flawed, refusing acknowledgement beyond the barest scraps of praise. Medical care never reached the ridge. Remedies came only from crude knowledge of roots and herbs. Broken bones healed crooked, illnesses lingered, deformities worsened. Yet Ezekiel called survival proof of Blackwood resilience. Some neighbors occasionally glimpsed the children when Ezekiel escorted them into town. Their strange appearances stirred whispers. Yet mountain men honored silence, believing interference dishonorable. The code of privacy shielded Ezekiel's fortress. Inside, boys endured more than physical hardship. Their minds bent under Ezekiel's teachings. He told them outsiders despised their blood, that only Blackwood purity could withstand the corruption waiting beyond the ridges. The compound grew like a distorted village. Cabins dotted the land, smoke rising from crude chimneys. Each dwelling housed boys divided by Ezekiel's decrees, separated yet bound by his endless hunger for control. Older boys began training younger ones in harsh routines. Obedience drills, hunting exercises, and rituals of loyalty became part of daily life. Ezekiel molded them not as sons, but as instruments. The deformities compounded with each generation. A boy born with 6 fingers was forced to chop wood daily, his hands blistered raw. Ezekiel declared him improved, though his condition hindered rather than strengthened. Another son, born with a twisted leg, limped through chores. Despite pain, he was expected to labor as any other. Ezekiel cataloged him too, noting structural imperfection with detached precision. Yet among the sons, resilience sparked. Bonds formed quietly between brothers who whispered doubts when Ezekiel wasn't near. They began to sense that his teachings were chains, not truths, though fear kept them silent. Food shortages struck during harsh winters. Sons starved beside dwindling fires, their bodies wasting. Still, Ezekiel proclaimed survival was purification, separating the weak from the strong. Hunger became another tool of domination. By the early 1950s, the compound's size could not hide forever. Too many cabins, too many sons, too many oddities glimpsed by hunters passing the ridge. Whispers spread faster than Ezekiel realized. Yet inside his fortress, he ruled undeterred. To him, every crooked spine, every fragile heart, every suffering boy was proof his bloodline endured. Ezekiel saw no nightmare, only destiny written in flesh. By the mid-1950s, strain fractured Ezekiel's dominion. His compound, once controlled with absolute order, began buckling under hunger, sickness, and swelling numbers of sons. The weight of secrecy pressed harder than ever. The main house decayed. Roof beams sagged beneath snow. Floors rotted under constant dampness. Sons huddled in cabins during winters, fires struggling against the cold. Survival consumed every breath, eroding Ezekiel's myth of strength. Brothers grew restless. Some, scarred from punishment, whispered rebellion in the dark. Younger sons questioned Ezekiel's teachings when deformities and deaths piled higher each year. Even fear could not entirely silence growing doubt. Supplies dwindled. Hunting provided little. Soil, once fertile, yielded smaller harvests. Ezekiel rationed food harshly, demanding loyalty in exchange for sustenance. Hunger hollowed cheeks, sharpened tempers, and sparked envy among starving sons. Illness spread unchecked. Without doctors, infections worsened. Coughs echoed through cabins, fevers lingered for weeks. Ezekiel declared sickness a test of worth, refusing aid. Stronger sons endured, weaker ones withered in silence. Joseph, the eldest, became increasingly unstable. His outbursts frightened younger brothers. Some feared him more than Ezekiel, yet Ezekiel praised his strength, grooming him further as heir, blind to the chaos his brutality caused. The compound's hierarchy began to crack. Older boys forced into authority abused their power, driving resentment. Younger ones muttered that Ezekiel's kingdom was rotting from inside, that no destiny lay in broken blood. One winter, a crippled son collapsed during woodcutting. Instead of compassion, Ezekiel dragged him before others, declaring weakness unacceptable. The boy's screams haunted the compound, fueling bitterness rather than obedience among witnesses. For the first time, silence no longer felt absolute. Brothers exchanged glances heavy with unspoken thoughts. The fortress that had stood unchallenged for 2 decades now carried fissures deepening with every passing season. Whispers of escape returned. Some sons recalled the failed attempt years earlier, but desperation gnawed at fear. Stories of distant towns, imagined freedoms, flickered like faint flames in the cold Appalachian night. Ezekiel sensed unease. He responded with stricter control, locking cabins, monitoring every movement. Yet his tightening grip revealed weakness. He feared rebellion, proving his rule depended less on strength and more on terror. Joseph, entrusted with enforcing order, often lashed out violently. Younger sons began to despise him, branding him nothing more than Ezekiel's shadow. What Ezekiel saw as loyalty, others saw as betrayal. The fortress itself became suffocating. Cabins leaned inward like walls closing. Smoke from weak fires choked lungs. Ezekiel preached endurance, but sons wondered whether survival was strength or simply prolonged suffering without purpose. Food thefts began. Hidden stores dwindled faster than Ezekiel accounted for. Someone had defied him, risking punishment. His paranoia deepened, and punishments grew harsher, though the thief's identity remained undiscovered. For younger sons, defiance became a spark. Quiet exchanges of bread, stolen moments of solidarity, small acts of rebellion, all showed that Ezekiel's control, though brutal, was not absolute anymore. The winter of 1956 struck brutally. Temperatures plummeted, snow buried paths, and starvation loomed. Sons shared glances that spoke of breaking points. The fortress that had endured for decades now trembled under hunger's weight. Ezekiel, blind to collapse, continued preaching purity. He ignored hollowed faces, broken bodies, whispers of rebellion. To him, suffering was sacrifice, proof his experiment endured. To his sons, it was proof of failure. The cracks had widened. Beneath Ezekiel's fortress of fear, resistance stirred. For the first time in years, silence no longer guaranteed obedience. Something was coming, and Ezekiel's reign could not remain unchallenged forever. The winter of 1957 tightened its grip upon the mountains. Snow fell endlessly, burying paths, cutting the compound from any contact. Inside, hunger gnawed at bones, and silence grew heavy with desperation. Among the sons, one youth carried a spark of defiance. Unlike his brothers, he studied every detail of Ezekiel's rule, memorizing weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to attempt the impossible. He prepared in secret. Over months, he collected scraps, a rusted knife, twine, matches hidden from Ezekiel's watchful eyes. Each stolen item was a step closer to freedom, each risk taken in silence. The boy studied stars at night, learning directions beyond the ridges. He observed hunters from afar, memorizing how they tracked through snow. Quietly, he shaped himself into an escapee, though fear shadowed him constantly. Opportunity arrived when Ezekiel departed for supplies, leaving Joseph to enforce order. Joseph demanded repairs on a collapsed roof, keeping older brothers occupied. For the defiant youth, the path opened for the first time. Clutching his hidden bundle, he slipped into the storm. Snow blinded him, wind howled, but he pressed forward. Each step away from the compound felt like rebellion carved into frozen earth. He wandered for hours, guided by dim moonlight. Hunger gnawed, cold pierced skin, but determination burned hotter. Behind him, Ezekiel's world dissolved into mist. Ahead, the unknown stretched like a dangerous promise. Nights were brutal. He curled beneath fallen trees, shivering until dawn. He chewed dried scraps saved in secrecy, knowing supplies would not last. Yet every morning, he forced himself forward, chasing freedom's whisper. On the third day, frostbite blackened his fingers. Weakness slowed his pace. He stumbled through drifts, collapsing often, only to rise again. Each fall echoed Ezekiel's voice, reminding him failure meant capture. But he refused. Every step forward was defiance against years of cruelty. He recalled starving winters, beatings, brothers suffering. Escape was not for himself alone, but for every captive still trapped. Exhaustion nearly claimed him. At dawn of the fourth day, he collapsed beside a frozen stream, unable to rise. Darkness closed in, his body trembling violently. Freedom seemed moments from slipping away forever. Then salvation came unexpectedly. A hunter from a nearby settlement spotted movement among snowdrifts. Expecting a wounded animal, he discovered instead a half-conscious boy, frost-bitten, gaunt, but alive. Shock gave way to swift action. The hunter carried him to town, where men gathered in disbelief. Through gestures and broken whispers, the boy described Ezekiel's compound, his tyranny, and the sons trapped in squalor beyond the ridges. The men listened, horrified, yet skeptical. Could such horrors exist in their mountains? Yet the boy's condition told truth louder than words: scars, frostbite, malnourishment. His testimony could not be ignored any longer. A sheriff assembled a group of deputies. Armed with rifles, they marched through snow toward the Blackwood Ridge. What they found beyond those trees would shock every man present, forever scarring their memories. Cabins sagged under decay. Smoke clung heavy in the air. Sons with twisted limbs and hollow eyes stared at strangers in disbelief. For many, it was the first time seeing outsiders in their lives. Ezekiel confronted the men, furious at intrusion. He claimed independence, accused them of violating his land. But when his son's conditions were revealed, his words collapsed. His fortress of fear had finally fallen. The boy's escape had broken Ezekiel's reign. For 2 decades, silence protected him. In one act of defiance, a son shattered that silence, turning whispers of suspicion into undeniable proof of monstrous truth. Deputies dragged Ezekiel from his compound in chains. He resisted fiercely, shouting about purity and destiny. Yet the sight of his sons, broken, starving, deformed, spoke louder than his endless, twisted proclamations. In the sheriff's custody, Ezekiel displayed no remorse. He preached his doctrine of bloodlines even while confined. To him, prison walls meant nothing. His obsession with purity remained unshaken, his arrogance unbroken. The trial drew crowds from across counties. Courtrooms packed with men eager to glimpse the tyrant who had ruled in secrecy. Whispers filled benches, disbelief colliding with outrage at the horrors uncovered. Ezekiel's defense claimed insanity. His lawyers argued his obsession with purity detached him from reality, but witnesses countered. His journals proved calculation, not madness. He planned meticulously, showing deliberate intent in every act. Sons testified reluctantly, voices trembling as they recounted years of captivity. They described hunger, punishments, deformities, and Ezekiel's unrelenting grip. Each word carved deeper scars into the minds of those listening in court. Joseph, torn between loyalty and rage, delivered the most chilling testimony. He admitted enforcing his father's commands, yet revealed brutal punishments inflicted upon him too. His broken voice reflected both victimhood and complicity. Medical examiners presented findings: congenital deformities, heart defects, malnourishment. Their reports confirmed what witnesses described. Generations of consanguinity had produced suffering etched into flesh. Ezekiel's experiment was no theory. It was horror embodied. The prosecutor portrayed him as a tyrant masquerading as patriarch. He argued that Ezekiel enslaved brothers, exploited sons, and destroyed futures in pursuit of vanity. Each point painted him more monstrous than imagined. Ezekiel interrupted proceedings often, ranting about strength and destiny. He claimed his sons were chosen, superior, misunderstood. Judges silenced him repeatedly, but his lack of remorse hardened the jury's conviction against him. When the verdict came, silence blanketed the courtroom. Guilty on multiple counts: kidnapping, abuse, unlawful imprisonment. Sentenced to consecutive life terms, Ezekiel would never walk free again. His fortress had crumbled permanently. In prison, he remained defiant. Guards reported him scribbling on scraps, muttering about purity, lecturing fellow inmates. He never acknowledged wrongdoing, never expressed regret, convinced still that his vision had meaning. For his sons, the trial was both liberation and torment. Exposed to public gaze, they struggled with shame and confusion. Freedom tasted strange after years of confinement. Trauma lingered heavier than any chain. Authorities debated what to do with them. Institutions were unprepared for men born of such circumstances. Some were placed in hospitals, others in orphanages, others into reluctant foster arrangements. No solution fit their needs. Scholars studied the case extensively. Geneticists examined medical records, sociologists analyzed isolation's effects, historians documented cultural silence that allowed horrors to persist. Ezekiel's fortress became a grim landmark in the study of human darkness. The trial's publicity shook mountain communities. Men questioned their code of silence, realizing privacy had shielded cruelty. Conversations about responsibility and intervention spread, shifting culture in ways Ezekiel never anticipated. For decades, Ezekiel's name carried infamy. He died behind bars, unrepentant, remembered not as visionary but as tyrant. His grave was unmarked, his legacy written only in tragedy carved across generations. His sons bore scars that no courtroom could erase. They carried twisted spines, fragile hearts, fractured minds. Yet their survival was testimony too, proof that even under tyranny, resilience refused to die. Thus the trial ended one reign, but the echoes endured. Ezekiel's tyranny was silenced by law, yet the lessons of his fortress became warnings carved forever into the mountains he once ruled. The Blackwood compound collapsed after Ezekiel's arrest, but its shadows lingered. Abandoned cabins rotted into the soil, yet memories remained. Men in nearby towns spoke cautiously, burdened by guilt for years of silence. The surviving sons faced a world they had never known. Thrust into institutions, they encountered rules, machines, and strangers whose language felt alien. Freedom tasted sharp, but confusion made it nearly unbearable. Medical evaluations revealed staggering conditions. Many carried heart defects, kidney failures, brittle bones. Others bore neurological scars, tremors, seizures, unstable moods. Doctors documented everything, each case a grim record of prolonged consanguinity. Some sons struggled with behavior beyond comprehension. Raised in isolation, they feared crowds, recoiled from sudden sounds, and spoke in broken fragments. Therapists described them as men trapped between childhood and adulthood. A few adapted slowly. With patience, some learned trades: carpentry, blacksmithing, farming outside institutions. They built small lives, carrying scars yet proving resilience. For them, survival became defiance against Ezekiel's legacy. Joseph, however, remained tormented. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, his mind fractured beyond repair. He drifted through psychiatric wards, haunted by voices of loyalty to his father. He died young, another casualty of the experiment. One deaf son thrived despite hardships. Through sign language taught by dedicated instructors, he communicated for the first time. His intelligence astonished scholars, showing brilliance Ezekiel dismissed. His story became a beacon of possibility. Another son, though twisted by scoliosis, found solace in art. He crafted carvings from wood, each piece carrying both pain and beauty. His work exhibited in regional galleries, offering dignity stolen in childhood. Yet not all found peace. Several remained institutionalized for life, requiring constant care. They rocked in silence, eyes lost to memories of cabins, punishments, hunger. Their suffering reminded all of horrors endured. Geneticists studied preserved blood samples, analyzing patterns across generations. Their research advanced understanding of heredity, though at unbearable cost. Ezekiel's sons, unwilling test subjects, contributed unwillingly to science that sought to prevent repetition. The mountains themselves changed. Communities recognized silence as complicity. Men built stronger networks, ensuring neighbors never vanished unseen again. Intervention replaced secrecy. Out of tragedy, responsibility grew like new growth after fire. In time, the Blackwood property was seized by the county. Cabins collapsed, forests reclaimed the land. Eventually, the ground was turned into a memorial park dedicated to resilience, warning future generations. A plaque marked the entrance. To the sons who endured, may their struggles teach vigilance. No mention of purity, no glory for Ezekiel, only remembrance of suffering transformed into lessons. For surviving sons, the legacy was complex. Some chose anonymity, erasing the Blackwood name. Others carried it openly, warning of darkness born from pride, secrecy, and domination. Each path carried pain, yet also choice. Historians later described Ezekiel as a tyrant disguised as patriarch. His doctrine of purity produced only ruin. His fortress proved not strength, but the fragility of men blinded by obsession. Generations later, echoes persisted. Some descendants bore mild genetic conditions, reminders of Ezekiel's choices. Yet they lived freer lives, choosing futures their father once denied. Blood no longer bound them in chains. Ezekiel's story endures as a warning. Isolation breeds silence. Pride corrupts vision. Domination destroys kin. His reign ended, but lessons carved into those ridges outlasted him, shaping laws, science, and memory. In the Appalachian mist, the ruins of his fortress stand forgotten by trees, but remembered by history. Darkness once ruled there, but resilience ensured light endured, carried forward by the very sons he tried to control.